I hope you have a copy of that role category questionnaire, which is really just two lists of items that describe two different people. I want to talk to you about how to score it. It's really straightforward. I'm going to have you add up the total number of items from both sides all together. And so this is kind of an example of how you might do it. If Chris is sharp and competent and totally sincere. Totally and sincere count as one item, so adjectives or adverbs just get counted as one. And remember, you were supposed to skip over physical characteristics, so Irish or tall are going to score 0. Also make sure that you don't count any duplicates. So hurried and very hurried are really the same thing, right? And so the second item doesn't get a score, but the first item does. And so here we would have a total of 5 points. I'm suspecting you probably got more than 5 points, but this is just an example of how to do it. So you're adding up the total number of items from both sides all together, leaving out any physical descriptors or any direct duplications. And then add those all together. And at this point, you should have a number for your total score for the role category questionnaire. And we'll talk about what that number means. I want to clarify something really quickly. I keep on calling this Jesse Delia's role category questionnaire. It's a questionnaire that he used very frequently in his research, and so I always in my mind just kind of associate it with him. It was actually developed in 1965 by Crockett, so that's the original source. And I mention that because this questionnaire has a long history of being tested. There have been all sorts of follow-up science done to validate this as a measure of cognitive complexity. So cognitive complexity has to do with the number of structures in your head, in your mind, in your cognitive system that you use to make sense of people and things in the world around you. And there are some distinct advantages to having a higher level of cognitive complexity. Somebody who is cognitively simplistic has fewer tools in order has fewer tools that allow them to make sense of the world around them, and so they tend to think in more simplistic ways. Folks that are more cognitively complex can see nuances, they can see multiple perspectives, they have a greater depth in their ability to make sense of all sorts of things in the world around them. Delia and colleagues argued that this measure of cognitive complexity is separate than intelligence. Well, intelligence has been traditionally measured as your ability to solve logic problems, to solve little puzzles. And cognitive complexity is a different kind of intelligence than that. So I don't know that it is necessarily not an indicator of intelligence, but it doesn't really correlate with traditional measures of the kind of intelligence that we have traditionally measured in doing research. But I think it has a lot more to do with emotional and interpersonal intelligence more than anything else. So the total number of items is a quantitative measure of your cognitive complexity, and anytime we can measure a variable quantitatively, that allows us to do all sorts of research and additional work. And this whole questionnaire and cognitive theory has been the basis of a lot of research based on these kinds of results, because we can look at how cognitive complexity connects to things like, for example, communication competence. And as you would probably expect, people that have a higher level of cognitive complexity also measure higher in tests of communication competence. So more skilled communicators tend to start off by being more cognitively complex. A level of cognitive simplicity generally means that you're not as accomplished at being at communicating or getting what you want as the result of your communication. So this total number of items, that total RCQ score that you calculated, as a measurement of cognitive complexity. Most college students score between 15 and 25. So we find that upwards of 70% of college students are in that 15 to 25 range. And so you can kind of compare where you were to 70% of folks. In general, Delia, Crockett, and all of their colleagues tended to define a score of over 25 as being highly cognitively complex, so having a high level of cognitive complexity. When I do this questionnaire in classes, I often ask folks what their score was. And sometimes I get folks that are in the range of 40, 45, 50. I think I had somebody within the space of just 10 minutes came up with like close to 60 items. And every time I have asked those folks a couple of key questions. One of those questions is, do you have multicultural experiences? Meaning, for example, did you grow up in a home that had one cultural system and yet go to school in what you thought was a different cultural system, and so you had to kind of work back and forth between those cultural systems? And a huge number of people indicate that that's true. Even the ones that didn't do that. I'm finding folks that scored the highest in cognitive complexity will tell me that they have experienced multiple cultures, either through extensive travel or just being in situations where they spend a lot of time around people that are different than themselves. And so there are things that seem to develop cognitive complexity, and interacting with people from other cultures, at least in my experiences and talking to folks, seems to have some kind of relationship to a higher level of cognitive complexity. It's one of the reasons why I encourage people to travel as much as possible when it's safe to do so, and it will be again sometime. And if you have the opportunity to study abroad, if you have the opportunity to do some kind of semester or year in an exchange program, I always encourage people to do that because I think it is especially good to have those experiences. There are some folks that would argue that your level of cognitive complexity can't be increased, and I don't know that that's necessarily true. The research is sort of split on that. I'm definitely on the side that I believe it is possible to increase your level of cognitive complexity, and having a wide variety of experiences, a lot of life experience, and experiences with people that are significantly different from yourself tend to increase that level of cognitive complexity. That number also gives us a sense of your level of need for cognition. And I'm pretty sure your textbook talks about the idea of need for cognition, or the variable need for cognition. Some people have a very high level of need to think about stuff, to process, to make sense, to weigh options, and other people have a very low level of need for cognition. In general, folks with more simple cognitive systems, who are less cognitively complex, tend to have a lower need for cognition. Folks that have a high level of cognitive complexity tend to have a high need for cognition, as you might expect, and that's not always a good thing. People who have a high level of cognitive complexity, at least in talking to folks that score high on this particular scale, also seem to relate to me that they have a difficult time making decisions sometimes, that they have the experience of frequently engaging paralysis by analysis. They're thinking about something so much and seeing so many different sides and have such a complex view of things that it sometimes becomes difficult to make a decision, to be decisive, to kind of get past thinking and move into the firm, decisive side of things. And so some people have a high level of need for cognition. Some people have a low need for cognition. In terms of persuasion and persuadability, we know that people who are high in cognitive complexity tend to be more persuasive, and I will develop some reasons later on as to why that's probably true. We know that people who have a low need for cognition aren't necessarily all that persuadable. And so this brings us back to kind of that middle ground again, where people are most persuadable if they have neither a very high need for cognition nor a very low need for cognition. So I just wanted to create that connection between levels of cognitive complexity and high or low need for cognition. But wait, there's more on the role category questionnaire. So in addition to this idea of cognitive complexity, the theory of constructivism, developed by Delia and colleagues, really focuses in on the total sum of what's in your mind, your entire cognitive system, or what would be your cognitive schemata, and how we use that to both receive messages, design messages, and everything in between. So the cognitive schemata is the total sum of your attitudes, values, beliefs, behaviors, information, emotions, everything going on in your head. And all of that stuff is structured in a particular way. And one of the areas, there are four particular areas of the cognitive schemata that Delia is especially interested in. So one of the four areas that cognitive theory focuses on are constructs. Constructs are pairs of opposite terms. If you look at your role category questionnaire, I told you we were going to come back to this. If you look at any one word and think about the opposite of that word, that pair is a construct. So if one of the words is smart, and in your head, the way you structure that, the opposite of smart is unintelligent, then that would be one construct. So each of the things on your role category questionnaire, both for the person you like and for the person that you dislike, plus the opposites of all of those terms, are constructs. Now, you may have some overlap, you may not have some overlap between the two sides, but the reasons constructs are important is that they're what we use to make sense of people and things in the world around us by judging folks, figuring that people and things fit into one category or the other. The terms on your role category questionnaire are interpersonal constructs because they're ones you use to make sense of other people. And Delia makes a convincing argument that the number of interpersonal constructs you have is a good indicator of your overall cognitive complexity. There are more than just interpersonal constructs. What we do with constructs is differentiate or tell apart, or in simple terms, judge. Humans are very judgy kinds of creatures. You go about your life looking at folks and putting them into categories, trustworthy, not trustworthy. And for anybody that might say, oh, we shouldn't judge other people, yeah, you should. It just depends on how you do it. I mean, having good judgment about who you have babysit your kids and who shouldn't be doing that job is pretty important stuff, and it requires a high level of differentiation. The thing is the more constructs you have, the more complexity you have for understanding other folks. So somebody who is prejudicial, for example, somebody who may be racist, is severely handicapped by a simplistic cognitive system. They kind of differentiate the world into just two categories. You know, people that look like me, they're good. People that don't look like me, they're bad. Right? And that simplistic cognitive system is extremely limiting in how they deal with the outside world. And they don't even actually know enough to know that it's a problem most of the time. If you have been around other folks from different ethnicities, different cultures, you have probably developed a more complicated system of ways of making sense of people in the world around you. And so, humans see race or ethnicity. Humans see gender. It's something we're sort of programmed to notice in the world around us. I find it kind of interesting when people say, I'm colorblind, I don't see race. Yes, you do. And it's okay to see that. The question from a cognitive standpoint is that all you're seeing? Are you limited to a narrow number of constructs that mean you see the world through a simplistic cognitive schemata that inhibits your ability to really appreciate what's going on in the world around you? So everybody sees color, everybody sees race. But the big question is are you limited in your level of complexity that you can't think beyond that, or do you see a more wide range of possibilities out there? One of the first things you do when you meet someone is begin engaging in this process of differentiation. You engage in this process of kind of sorting out who they are. If you look at your role category questionnaire, the terms that you listed toward the top are probably the terms that you tend to use earliest on in making sense of other people. The ones down toward the bottom list are probably terms that you apply a little later on. So we apply some constructs earlier, we apply them later. That's not an exact formula, but it does have to do a lot with how we make sense of the world. Think about what might be one of the first constructs somebody applies. One of the very, very first constructs, suppose a new person you've never met or known before is suddenly in front of you. You're going to begin differentiating. What do you think is one of the very first things you're doing? If you're thinking appearance, that's true. It's probably a more specific form of appearance. It's definitely physical characteristics. One of the very first things you probably differentiate is sex. You kind of put the person in the category of male or female. And that's probably biologically programmed into humans to do. And so it's not surprising that would be an early sort of a construct to apply. But that's also why some folks stall out when they can't figure out the gender of somebody. What I mean is there are occasions where you may have heard folks whispering about somebody else, and generally whispering really kind of rude and inappropriate things of what are they? It's like that's kind of telling me that they have a limited cognitive system, that they can't see beyond just determining sex, and they have to diagnose that for themselves. They have to differentiate it before they can move any further. So humans sort of stall out if they can't easily put somebody into the categories that they have. If you happen to be more cognitively complex, you may have gender categories beyond just male and female. You may have a category of male, female, androgynous, transgendered, genderqueer. There's any number of other categories that you might use to kind of help you make sense of another person. And you may have enough other constructs and a wider range of constructs, assuming that you're cognitively complex, to not feel the need to just diagnose that one thing about another individual. And if you can't do it, you can't go any further, you can't talk to them, you can't function until you figure that out. So early on, we diagnose or differentiate a lot of physical characteristics. We determine sex. We look at ethnicity. That happens really early on. And that probably goes back to social evolution. If you were an early species attempting to survive on the plains of the savannah, right? People that looked like you were good. They were family. You shared food with them. People that didn't look like you were bad. You should kill them before they try to kill you and steal your food. And unfortunately, a segment of the population does not seem to have evolved beyond that kind of knuckle-dragging, just recently out of the cave view of reality. So there was a time in human evolution that absolutely you needed to recognize social groups and who was in your in-group, who was like you and who wasn't like you, because it was a matter of life and death. And if you survived, you came from the folks that were able to do that. So you have a genetic and social history of being the people that survived. The folks that weren't able to make those differentiations didn't survive. They got killed and had their food eaten before they were able to survive and pass on their genetic material to future generations. And so that's, in my opinion, a really powerful force that means humans are kind of compelled to make sense of the world on the basis of who looks like me, who doesn't look like me. So Unfortunately, some people don't have the level of cognitive complexity to also understand humans beyond those sorts of categories. And these people are bigots, they're racists, and they don't have the ability to see the world in more nuanced kinds of ways that somebody who is more cognitively complex does. So somebody who is more cognitively complex sees gender, they see race, they see all sorts of physical characteristics, they see age, and they see body type, and they see all of those things, and they also have an extraordinary number of additional categories beyond those things that they use to make sense of people and things in the world around them. So these constructs, by the way, are domain specific. So I've been talking about interpersonal constructs. You also have constructs for other things. You have constructs for I don't know what makes for a good textbook. Maybe I know I have those constructs. You might have constructs that allow you to either think complexly about wine or simplistically. Right? So how do you make sense if somebody puts a glass of wine in front of you? What are you able to differentiate? Is it white, red, pink, bubbles, no bubbles? It's relatively simplistic. If you learn about wine, you develop a whole other vocabulary for talking about wine. And if you're one of those folks that can differentiate a Syrah from a Malbec or something, then those additional constructs allow you to do finer, more subtle, more complicated, more sophisticated differentiation, and that means that you have a more cognitively complex system. So part of increasing your vocabulary and cognitive complexity is not just a matter of vocabulary, right? As you develop your vocabulary, you develop more complicated ways of seeing things in the world around you. What do you know about snow skiing, right? Folks who snow ski have a lot of terminology. They make a lot of differentiation. All of the stuff out there on the slopes is not just snow. They have a vocabulary for all of that stuff. And so when I say that constructs are domain specific, it means that we have groups of constructs built around particular topic areas. But Delia argued, again, that interpersonal constructs were the best measurement of overall cognitive complexity, because you may not have a lot of constructs for wine or snow skiing, but you definitely have constructs for other people, and that's common to all humans. So one area of the cognitive schemata that Delia was interested in were constructs. Those are those pairs of opposite terms that we use to differentiate, to make sense of people. Another thing we have are prototypes. Prototypes are organized sets of constructs that we use to kind of form a sense of an ideal, a perfect something. So you might have a prototype for the perfect job, or you may not. You might have a prototype for the perfect life partner. You might have a prototype for the perfect professor, for the perfect student, for the perfect dog, for the perfect house, whatever else. Some prototypes are more developed, some prototypes are less developed, but those prototypes are collections. That mean we don't have to think about every individual construct. They're just ways of kind of generalizing things together. So prototypes in some ways really are these generalizations. Sorry about that, getting a little ahead of myself. So prototypes are these collections of an ideal something. If you are on the market to buy a house and you don't have a well-developed, clear prototype of what it is you want, what meets your ideals, then you're going to see house over house after house. You're not going to like any of them, and you're probably not going to be able to really explain why, because of an underdeveloped prototype. Right now, having a prototype for an ideal job may not be that important. You may still be figuring that out. You may still be developing what for you will be the perfect job. And so sometimes prototypes are less developed and it doesn't matter. Sometimes they're underdeveloped and it does matter, and it creates a problem. Sometimes prototypes are set too high. Sometimes prototypes are set too low. If you have some vision of the perfect ideal job and keep on turning down an offer and another offer and another offer and another offer because it doesn't live up to your perfect ideal, that becomes a problem. Similarly, I know folks who go out and date jerk after jerk after jerk that aren't good people and aren't good for them, right? But they have a prototype that's set so low that any jerk will live up to that low prototype. And so prototypes being set too high, prototypes being set too low can be problematic. They certainly get in the way of our thinking. They get in the way of our ability to persuade, our ability to be persuaded, and all sorts of other things. They also lead to things like unconscious bias. So there's a old riddle, and let me see if I can get this right. The riddle is that a man and his son are in a horrible, awful, terrible car accident. The father dies. The son is rushed to the hospital. In the emergency room, the doctor takes one look at the boy and says, "I can't operate on him. He's my son." And there's a lot of people that are baffled by this and go through all sorts of different lines of thinking trying to figure out, well, how is it possible that the father died in the car accident, but how is it possible that the emergency room surgeon can't operate because the boy is the surgeon's son? How is that possible? And people go through, well, stepfather. I've heard folks come up with all sorts of things. You may have figured this out, especially if you're more cognitively complex. I mean, the answer is really pretty easy. The surgeon is the boy's mother, right? But a lot of folks don't think about that because they have a prototype of a surgeon, of a physician, of a doctor, and the older somebody is, the more likely it is that's firmly set in place, and they just don't have the thinking pattern to think of a doctor as anything as being prototypically male. And so sometimes things get thrown into a prototype that don't necessarily belong there, but end up getting in our way of thinking. And so if you have some kind of construct that's contained within a larger prototype of what makes for a good job candidate. Suppose you're a human resources manager. Suppose you're involved in hiring people for a particular position. Suppose you have some construct embedded in a prototype. It actually means that you can discriminate against people in spite of your best intentions, in spite of being a perfectly good person, but just unaware that there are these other constructs that get into play and go along with it. This is why female engineers have trouble getting jobs sometimes, because there's a particular prototype in place and has nothing to do with your skills, abilities, and qualifications. I'm sure some of it does, but if there are other things in those prototypes, those become problematic. And so prototypes are an interesting phenomenon within your cognitive schemata that affects how you see the world and how you do things. Another area of the cognitive schemata are stereotypes. Now be careful with the definition here. Most people kind of, as an automatic response, well, stereotypes are terrible, stereotypes are bad, you shouldn't have stereotypes. Well, hold on. In the social sciences, A stereotype is simply a general pattern where we know something about a group, therefore we kind of know something about one thing that is a part of that group. And in and of itself, that's not a problem. I have a stereotype that saves me an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of money, and I don't think there's any problem with it. And the stereotype I have is about hack and slash horror films. And my stereotype is, I don't enjoy them much. If you do, good for you, great. But what that stereotype does for me is it means I don't have to go see Saw and say, wow, I hated it, what a waste of time and money, and then go see Saw 2 and say, wow, I hated it, what a waste of time and money, and then go see Hostel and say, wow, what a waste of time and money, and then go see Halloween 14 or whatever and say, gosh, what a surprise, that was a waste of time and money. I can kind of group things into that particular genre. I know something about them, and it saves me cognitive energy to be able to do this. Stereotyping is a normal part of the cognitive process. It's what people do. It's how your mind works. Whether you want it to or not, you do stereotyping. You group things together. And there are all sorts of things that indeed does save you all sorts of time and money in terms of going out shopping and talking to other people, in picking classes. There are all sorts of things that it's helpful. However, stereotypes can also go horribly wrong. So the reason that people think stereotypes are bad is they've run into folks who have bad stereotypes, and they can go very, very wrong. So if those stereotypes are based in hasty generalizations or are based in sweeping generalizations, or more commonly both of those things together, then the stereotypes become very problematic. And this is the source, for example, of prejudicial stereotypes, or gender stereotypes, or racial stereotypes. A hasty generalization and sweeping generalization, these are fallacies in reasoning. They're forms of faulty thinking that you might have learned about in another class. A hasty generalization is a stereotype that's built from too little information, and a sweeping generalization is one that's applied too broadly. And so if I go to a film festival and I see one foreign film and I don't like it, and from that experience I say, all foreign films stink, I'm never going to see another one again, right? I've created really an unfair stereotype based on a hasty generalization. I only saw one example, and a sweeping generalization. I just applied that to all of the films in that particular genre. And this is where racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, all sorts of other prejudicial, bigoted problem thinking comes from, and it's why it's so difficult to combat and change. If you've ever tried to get somebody who has a bigoted stereotype to think differently, you know that it's incredibly difficult. One of the reasons it's difficult is, to them, it feels like a normal way of making sense of the world. They're just looking at the information available to them and drawing conclusions. And they don't have the level of cognitive complexity to do that in an appropriate and fair kind of a way, and to recognize that stereotypes are pattern recognition, that it's important, but you also need to see things that don't meet the pattern and that are exceptions to that particular pattern. So, stereotypes are simply generalizations. They're not good or bad necessarily. In fact, they're something that humans do as part of their normal way of making sense of the world around them. And that makes them especially dangerous and especially problematic when they're built on faulty thinking, when they come out of a simplistic cognitive system, or when they're used to discriminate against folks or treat people unfairly. And that's why people can discriminate and treat others unfairly, have no idea that they're doing it, and think that they're fine, that there's nothing wrong. And trying to point that out to them becomes very, very difficult, partly because of defensiveness, partly because they're doing what feels to them to be a normal thought process. They're just making sense of the world. The fourth area of the cognitive schemata that Delia was particularly interested in, and that is a part of this whole constructivism theory, are scripts. Scripts are packages of how to do something. They're a set of procedures or a set of steps of, do this, do this, do this, do this, and they're kind of packaged together so you don't have to think about any individual piece in the step. When I get up in the morning, I'm not thinking really clearly, but there is a really distinct pattern that I follow that my cat has learned, and she now leads me through the pattern. But I get up, walk down a hallway, go out the front door, pick up a newspaper. Yes, I'm one of those weirdos that still gets a paper print newspaper. Take it in, set it down on the arm of the couch where I usually sit, go to a sliding door, open it up, let in some air. She checks for, prowlers or squirrels or some other enemy that she may need to chase away. I go get coffee, and then I go back, sit down, and start reading my newspaper. And I don't have to think about every step in that process. I just do it. It is so habitual that it's become scripted. And there's a lot of things that become scripted. And sometimes that's a really helpful kind of a thing. I mean, when I'm driving, I don't have to think about every step in the driving process. It's scripted in a way that it's kind of automatic. Remember when you were doing driver's ed, when you were first learning how to drive? It was exhausting because you had to pay attention to so many things that it just wore you out. And when you have to think hard about a lot of stuff, that does consume energy. It becomes tiring, right? But once a lot of those processes become scripted and sort of automatic, then that saves you time and energy, and you're not necessarily exhausted. You can function a little better afterwards. It's also why people who are talking on cell phones don't know that they're driving poorly. And if you tell them, often don't believe that they were driving poorly because they have so much of the driving process scripted that they don't even really think that they're doing anything other than following the script that they've always followed. Sometimes arguments get scripted into relationships. One of my areas of study is in episodes of repetitive conflict in interpersonal relationships. And it's as if these conflicts become scripted into the relationship, and you run the script, you play out that scene, you have the argument, whether you needed to or not. It's just part of something triggers it, you begin the script, and you're into that set of conversational turns, whether you really wanted to go that direction or not. It became scripted in. So sometimes scripts are useful. They save cognitive energy, and it's why they're a problem, because they're a natural part of your cognitive system. When they go wrong, when they're problematic, when you develop a bad habit, for example, it becomes very difficult to break. So those are 4 areas of the cognitive schemata that Delia was especially interested in: constructs, prototypes, stereotypes, and scripts. There's probably a lot more that I could discuss with any of these, but that I think that gets us pretty far in terms of understanding the basics of Delia's constructivism. There are a lot of other theories that have developed out of the theory of constructivism. And so there's a whole package of other cognitive theories that kind of come back to Delia's constructivism. And so I wanted to introduce this theory of constructivism now because it provides some groundwork for other theories. Let me make a quick connection, though, between cognitive complexity and communication competence. I mentioned before that folks who have a greater degree of cognitive complexity tend to be more competent at doing communication. And there's a specific reason for that. So somebody that has a high level of cognitive complexity, a greater level of cognitive complexity, tends to have more of an ability to do something called social perspective taking. Social perspective taking is the ability to see things from a perspective other than your own, to really understand how other people may look at the world, may look at you, and how that might be similar to the way you look at the world, and how that might be different than how you look at the world. Folks who have a higher level of cognitive complexity have a cognitive system that allows them to see beyond just their own perspective, but also understand and appreciate other views, whether those are personal views, cultural views, group views, family views. They have more of an ability to see that and will often seek out perspectives other than their own. People that have a high ability to do social perspective taking tend to create more person-centered messages. Person-centered messages are messages that are designed for the other person to take in the way that you want them to take that message. So every now and then I hear somebody, blaming the other person for communication not working. Right? You just don't understand. You don't get it. They're blaming the other person for not understanding, rather than for taking the responsibility to design a message in a way that is clear to the other person, that takes into account their vocabulary, their beliefs, their viewpoint, the way they look at the world, and then design a message that is more compatible with that, or more likely to work for that other person. So you may notice that there are a lot of people that communicate in very self-centered, very egocentric kinds of ways. This is the way I communicate. The rest of the world better adapt to me, because I'm not adapting to the rest of the world. Right? I'm hoping you're not one of those people. But there are some people that are very self-centered, very egocentric. This is the way I do things. Everybody else adapt. Right? And that generally is done because they're not doing a whole lot of social perspective taking. Maybe they don't want to. Usually it's because they can't, and that's usually coming out of a simplistic cognitive system. So people that lack cognitive complexity aren't able to do as much social perspective taking. Therefore, they don't create person-centered messages, and they tend not to get what they want. So you'll find folks with a low level of cognitive complexity often complaining about things not going their way, why they don't get what they want, why people are idiots and won't do things the way that I think they should, or whatever else, why they can't persuade others, why they can't, for whatever reason, accomplish what they want to accomplish. And that really is coming from a position of a low level of cognitive complexity. On the other hand, people who have a high level of cognitive complexity can do social perspective taking, they create person-centered messages, and they're more likely to get what they want. They're more likely to create the outcome that they want to have. And that doesn't mean that they're altering what they want. Sometimes they do. But they have the ability to create person-centered messages that are more likely to be successful from the other person. So one important thing I think that comes out of this theory of constructivism is a connection between cognitive complexity and outcomes. If you intend to inspire someone, if you want to educate someone, if you want to persuade someone, that works best the more cognitively complex the source is, because then they do more social perspective taking. They have a greater appreciation for the other person's viewpoint and position. They design messages that are more compatible with that and then tend to get what they wanted. So I wanted to make that connection between communication competence and cognitive complexity. I think it's an important one. But like I said, there are a lot of other theories that pick up from this cognitive viewpoint and develop it further. And this is a good theory to kind of set up your understanding of other theories within the cognitive domain. What I'm going to do now is move away from general cognitive theory and move into a theory that specifically deals with one particular aspect of your cognitive schemata, and that particular aspect are attitudes. And so we're going to look at theories that focus on attitudes, or at least one particular theory that focuses on attitudes. Before we get there, though, I want to do a survey on some of your attitudes. And so don't worry about your answers here. Be honest. I'm not going to judge you one way or another. The survey is simply asking you to state how you feel about things, your opinion. You're going to see in this survey a set of statements. There's quite a few of them, but I want you to read through all of the statements. And so first off, just read through for understanding. And you don't need to go looking anything up to try to get the right answer. Just respond based on initially how those statements appear to you and what you know off the top of your head. So first, just read through each of the statements that I have listed for you. I think there's something like 13 statements or something. Don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere around there. So just stop for a second, read through all of them. And then there'll be a drop-down menu next to each of the statements. And I want you to first pick the one statement that most closely represents, out of all of them, your perspective, your point of view. So you get to pick just one statement that you most agree with, that most represents your position on immigration policy. And that's what all of the statements revolve around, is immigration policy. So pick the one that most represents your position overall on immigration policy. You can only pick one of those, and you will, in the drop-down menu, indicate my POV, my point of view. Secondly, go through the statements and indicate any item that you think is reasonable, that is acceptable. And in the pull-down menu, there will be a place to select reasonable. So that may be one statement, it may be none of the statements, it may be 10 of the statements. I don't know how many it's going to be. There is no specific number, so just indicate any of the statements that you think are reasonable. At this point, there are probably going to be some that you haven't selected yet, right? Read back through all of the statements, and it's kind of important that you follow the instructions. These instructions will be over on the survey as well for you, but I wanted to talk you through them because some people do better if I talk you through the instructions. So go back and read through all of the statements, the ones that are left that you haven't marked yet, and then indicate any that are not acceptable to you. Make a note about any of the statements that you would reject.